She almost used her hands to make pottery, but instead she used them to learn a language. Find out what she's doing with her hands now on this morning's Carolina People. Good morning. Welcome to Carolina People. This morning we're on 4th Avenue in Conway at the Coastal Regional Outreach Center for the South Carolina School for the Deaf and Blind. We're focused on interpreting services of the school, and we're visiting with the statewide director, Kathy Stoehr. Good morning, Kathy.
Good morning.
Thanks so much for being with us this morning.
That's my pleasure.
It's a big trip down from Spartanburg to get in here early this morning.
Yes, it's okay. Well, I travel the state quite a bit in my role as the supervisor for the interpreters.
I bet you do. How many interpreters will we have statewide?
For the School for the Deaf and Blind, we have 6 full-time interpreters, and we are located in the centers across the state. We also have approximately 25 part-time interpreters that we can call upon to do jobs that are maybe closer geographically to their area.
Mm-hmm. And the credentials must be pretty intense for interpreters.
It's an arduous task to learn any other language, particularly American Sign Language is not based on English. It's really its own language with its own grammatical structure, and makes use of space quite a bit. It's a visual gestural language, which makes it a little bit harder to learn than perhaps if you decided you wanted to go learn French and become very fluent in French.
Right.
It makes it a little bit different.
I'm sure. Real quick about yourself, Kathy. You originally from the area?
No, I'm not. I'm originally from College Park, Maryland, which is just outside of Washington, D.C.
What brought you down to the Palmetto State?
Well, I was raising 2 middle school children and decided to make a change, and we moved for me to take the job at the South Carolina School for the Deaf and the Blind. I was very interested in getting back to a residential facility and providing interpreting services, not only at the school setting for the staff there, but also the community, part of the community interpreting services that we do.
I'm sure. And so you moved straight down to Spartanburg from College Park?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
So that was a big, probably a big shift there from being in the D.C. area. Had you been involved in interpreting in the Washington, D.C. area at all?
Yes, actually, I began as a teacher. I have a master's degree in education for the deaf, and I began as a teacher in the residential programs of a high school that's located on the campus of Gallaudet University. And Gallaudet University is the first liberal arts university for deaf people. And working there, I just learned so much about the language and the culture of the people that it was a little bit easier for me to transition into becoming an interpreter.
What originally prompted the interest in getting into interpretive services or actually studying helping the deaf?
Growing up in College Park, we're so close to Gallaudet University that there's a very high percentage of deaf people who live in that area. And I happened to have the opportunity to take sign language as a high school student. So I began quite a number of years ago in high school and began there, and then decided that, it just got into my blood. I just really enjoyed it and thought, well, I will pair this skill with perhaps with my teaching skills, and then I went on to get the master's degree in education.
Do you remember your first class?
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
I'm sure it must have, for something like that, it's probably like, even though you don't remember your first grade, you remember your first grade teacher, you may not remember a lot of other things, but aspects of early schooling. And so your first class of American Sign Language must have been...
Absolutely. It was the first time, even though I lived in an area with lots of deaf people, it was the first time I met a deaf person. And she came to the high school and taught us, and it was just the best way because we couldn't communicate with her in any other way. So it was kind of like having a little mini immersion every day for that year of high school that I took it.
Is it perceived now that still the best instructors are persons that are hearing impaired? Or, from that aspect, you mentioned that a deaf person came and taught it.
Yes.
Of course, you're doing quite a bit of instruction, and is it difficult instructing and not being deaf?
It's so nice to take any language from a native speaker.
Right.
I mean, obviously, hearing people who are fluent in sign language can do instruction, but once you have a native speaker, then you just have that extra edge, because all of us who didn't grow up perhaps with deaf parents,
Right.
some interpreters do grow up with deaf parents and have ASL as a first language and English as a second language. And so their native skills would be a different skill set than mine. Even though I'm fluent, I still sometimes have an accent. You know, I have,
an accent.
Yeah, I have like a foreign accent. If you ever had an instructor in college who was not from the United States, but spoke English fluently, but still made a little bit of error here and there.
Right.
But because you're a native English speaker, you understood that person very well. And that's what happens with me sometimes, and with other interpreters who were not native. Even though we're fluent in the language, we may make a little error in, almost like an articulation error. And you go from there. Deaf people tend to understand it because it's close enough.
Right, right.
It's just not the way a native person might have said it.
Wow.
So, like being I'm a little bit of a foreign interpreter.
Yeah. And it is, of course, fascinating how you use the word said. The native person wouldn't have said it. I mean, this is clearly a language. It is just oftentimes utilizing your hands.
It is absolutely a language, completely separate from English grammatical structure and syntax. Part of what happens with interpreters, and really happened with me, was I began the process of learning the language still thinking in English. I thought in English, and I would pick a sign that would fit that English word. By the time I worked at Gallaudet University, and I was the only hearing person in my program, everyone was deaf.
Wow.
It was kind of like being dropped off in Paris, and it was sink or swim. And it was a very good experience for me. But at the same time, I had to begin to let go of that English in my head and begin to try to think in terms of the most concise and clear visual way to express a concept.
Right.
And that's what really good interpreters are able to do that very well. You listen to the English sentence, but you don't just use a movement for each word. You listen to the content of what the English sentence means, and then express that the way deaf people would express it,
right,
in a visual manner.
Kathy, so you had no family members or others who were hearing impaired or
I did
deaf?
not.
And
I did not.
that aspect, again, of growing up in College Park and being close to Gallaudet opened those doors for you. How about and of course you mentioned, and you opened that door, I mean, that aspect of having raised middle school children when you moved down to the area. Did they ever get an interest in American Sign Language from you?
Actually, yes. Particularly when they were very small, because I could sign to them out in public and tell them.
Oh yeah, quiet.
you know the mommy voice that tells children it's time. Well, I could sign it. Wow. And they vividly. When we just got together this weekend, they both vividly remember the exact sign for "Stop what you're doing" and "Stop it right now."
Oh my God, yeah.
And it's a real quick sign.
Yeah, give it to us. Can you share it with the viewers?
That's it.
That's it.
And it means finish. Stop.
Right. Yeah.
Stop what you're doing right now. And they both knew that part of it, and they have a little bit of interest in it, but they did not pursue that as a career.
Right, right. That's fascinating. And of course, it's just incredible when you think about it. Of course, being the only student in your class at one point where everyone around you was deaf, and of course, was there ever a sense where even a good ways only you felt at times even an outsider?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Oh yes. Very much so. It was a very difficult process for me to learn the language, begin to experience the culture, and understand what was different between the way my normal behavior would be and the way I had to be at work. And I used to remember going to work and going into the gates of Gallaudet and saying, okay, now I've got to switch over.
Yeah.
And it was a little bit difficult. I would go home and be with my family, my mom and dad, and so I keep signing, and they're like, Kathy, you don't need to do that.
Right. Not here, honey.
I can't, and I'd be like, okay, I got to sit on the hands then to be here, and then go back there and try to really stop thinking in English and begin to make sure I was being very clear in visual language. And I was working with middle school students at that time as well. These were the students I was in charge of, and I had some difficulty understanding them. And sometimes I was basically a residential assistant. So I had to discipline these students who were getting in trouble in the dorm. And I remember one time having to go find a student who was hard of hearing and bring him over and say, I want you to tell this other, I had to use basically relay interpreting.
Wow.
At sometimes, until I got on my feet and was able to understand better.
I'm sure folks would wonder about early on in the class when there were all deaf folks around you, if you ever felt like they were speaking behind you. I mean, you like doing things, communicating with each other. I guess it would be pretty difficult to speak without you knowing, unlike being in Paris and being dropped in there and being an English speaker and having to learn the language you know at times. They're speaking a language that you clearly have no clue what they're saying, and they're making fun of you. And
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a sign for that, actually, and they used it regularly. They would tease me and test me, and then, it takes years, actually.
Sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Then I did pretty well and became very involved with this group of deaf people, the staff and the students I worked with at Caltech.
You're still interpreting now on a pretty regular basis.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do.
You are.
Mm-hmm.
And that's on a statewide, and I know you mentioned that earlier, right, as we were starting, you're still traveling the state.
Yes, well, actually, all of our interpreting staff travels quite a bit because in the regional centers, each center has about a 12 to 14 county catchment area.
That's right.
And so there are deaf people all over the state, some in very rural areas, and deaf people who need services, need to go to the doctor, or need maybe help at the Department of Social Services or at Social Security. Those are the situations where we go and provide the communication access.
I think Dorothy had mentioned this Coastal Regional Outreach Center serves ORE plus 11 other counties. So, of course, the Conway and Florence branches are really within this very large Coastal Regional Outreach Center.
The interpreter who is here, Sonia Baird, covers Florence as well as Marion County. We do quite a bit of work all over this region.
How critical. What kind of, when you think about, that's a pretty sizable title, obviously, being the statewide director. And so that aspect, you're communicating with the other interpreters on a regular basis.
Very regular. Very regular. We work together as much as possible, and we try to meet about every 2 months. We'll try to come together to Columbia in the middle and meet. But it's important that as a supervisor, it's really important that I provide them the support they need in order to, we have some jobs that are very challenging, and sometimes the deaf person's ASL may be somewhat different than the standard ASL from where I am. Signs are regionally different, and so when you come to a new area, you have to kind of learn the new sign skill set. And they also, we screen the interpreters, and we continue to do quality assurance to make sure that our skills are matching the needs of the consumers in the area.
What are some of the meetings or jobs that are being interpreted here in our area, let's say in the Horry County area or in the Coastal Regional Outreach Center?
In your area, I think the majority of the work that is here for us are the hospitals, doctors' offices. We also do Department of Social Services when people have that need, Social Security, the Department of Health and Human Services. We also provide communication access for BabyNet, which is when they identify small children with disabilities. Sometimes deaf parents have hearing children, and BabyNet will also provide some services for that hearing child in terms of some exposure to language, spoken language, because if the parents are signing, and the baby is going to be signing first, but this hearing child needs exposure to English on a regular basis.
Right, that's critical.
So we do that kind of interpreting as well for those parents.
Linda Smith will be with us later in the week to talk about the early intervention program. We're excited to get her and a parent in, actually on Wednesday, I think. How would an agency go about getting an interpreter?
All they would need to do is to call their regional office and speak with the interpreter coordinator for that area, and they maintain the schedule and set up the appointments.
And of course, oftentimes, I guess there are different charges. There are oftentimes, I'm sure there must be some fees associated with that to help cover you all, albeit on the early intervention side, some of those aspects are covered by the state, I guess, or but there are charges oftentimes associated with.
Yes. Each state agency needs to maintain some of their budget. They probably have a line item for accommodations. In case they would need to provide any kind of accommodation. They may need to provide something on tape or on Braille, as well as in order to make their agency services accessible for deaf people, they would need to hire interpreters for that. And there's a fee associated with it. We don't have a state appropriation, and our services are not Medicaid billable, and so therefore the service provider pays the fees to the School for Deaf and Blind, which covers our salaries and some of the travel.
Oh yeah.
It's not a profit making.
Sure.
My director told me the goal is break even.
Oh yeah.
So that's about where we are.
I heard that not too long ago when someone was down from Spartanburg, that there is a real desire there. The interpreting statewide is not a place, a moneymaker, for instance, not. But surely to break even is a goal. Absolutely.
That's our goal.
Yes.
And it's good. We want to provide the service in the most cost-effective manner, because really our mission is to make sure the communication is accessible for the deaf citizens of South Carolina. That's what we want to do. We also do some pro bono interpreting when we can and when the situation deems. But for the most part, we charge the agencies who are providing services to the deaf individuals.
You know, I pulled off just a little something about interpreting this morning online. It was fascinating. Interpreting is not an easy task. Requires physical stamina, endurance, as well as great knowledge of our own language. And it went on to talk about an interpreter must always render the message faithfully and must be able to match the mode of communication of the person of whom they're interpreting.
Yeah.
You know, when we think about that, of course, you see folks either oftentimes in a church, someone's interpreting for the pastor, or you'll see it in a courtroom, someone's interpreting for the witness. You know, as I thought about that in a courtroom, there's probably, counsel wants an interpreter for both sides, particularly on some major cases. What's that like for y'all, being under the hot seat for someone, interpreting for a witness, for instance?
It's one of the most stressful types of interpreting that we do, but we provide most of the interpreting to the South Carolina court system. You have to have an interpreter of a very specific certification level. Interpreters, all of my full-time interpreters are certified, but then there are different levels of certification, and the courts obviously require the highest level.
Right.
So I only have 4 people at those levels. So we travel a great deal and we work together on the cases. But yes, the best practice for that is for each side, the prosecution to have 2 interpreters, the defendant to have 2 interpreters, and 1 monitoring interpreter for the judge. And as you can see, that's 5 people already. So it's very, very difficult. We clearly need more interpreters in South Carolina, and particularly more interpreters at that level.
Yeah. How do you all go about searching folks out? I mean, is there surely would require quite a bit of training. It
requires quite a bit of training, and actually the training requirements for certification are being raised at this point. It's going to require a 4-year degree from a university or a college by 2011 in order to be eligible to sit for the certification exams.
Wow.
At this point, there's nothing there at this point. By 2007, I think you have to have a 2-year degree, and then they give the 4 more years for people to get that degree so they're able to sit for the exam. But an interpreter needs a broad-based liberal arts education. You have to know a little bit about everything.
Right.
And I feel like after all the interpreting I've done, I'm great at cocktail parties. I know a little bit about everything.
Yeah. Oh, I bet. I bet.
And I always thought if I was really quick, I could really do well on Jeopardy.
You know, I think back to those words, Kathy, you don't need to do it here in the house, the words of your parents. How do you sit on your hands through the day? I mean, you must constantly, like right now,
I know.
You've done a great job of keeping your hands by your side or down there on your knee.
I know.
How do you keep without, are there times, I guess, when you're speaking that you're doing both?
Yes.
That's pretty regular?
Yes.
Okay.
Especially where I am on the campus, because my office is located on the campus, and that's quite a mix of deaf and hearing people. And so, and one of the goals to be on the campus, and it's a very good thing for the children to see, is to have access to incidental language. Like as hearing people, we have access to incidental language all the time. You overhear something, even in a restaurant, or at the dinner table when you were young, you heard your mother and father talking about things. There's a lot of learning happening then.
Right.
So we want the deaf children to see sign language all the time. Even if we're not talking directly to that deaf child, I want the deaf child to be able to look over and maybe see me talking to another person and be able to glean some incidental learning from that. It's just we want a very visual language-rich environment for them. So at work I sign almost all the time.
And at times, since there's so much, you even want that deaf child to glean something when you're not signing, right? I mean, say that again. When you said you want the deaf child to be able to glean something when you're signing to someone else?
Yes, I want them to be able to, if I was in the cafeteria, for example, and I was having a conversation with another adult, a hearing child would have access to kind of listening in on that. And I don't mean like eavesdropping or rude, but just that kind of always having that exposure and with their ears open. Well, with deaf children, we want them to have visual exposure to language all the time. And that's one of the beauties of the South Carolina School for the Deaf and the Blind, that so many people do sign there. And oftentimes students in a mainstream setting may not have that opportunity because probably only their interpreter can sign. But in an environment like ours, we want them to see language around them all the time. And that's just, that's a wonderful thing to boost their English production, because having ASL as a base language helps children get to English. And one of the goals, of course, because they do live in the United States and English is the majority language, we want those students to have, competency in English. But the best way to get it is to have competency in ASL first, and then move into English as a second language.
For the children statewide who don't end up on campus in Spartanburg, I'm sure there are efforts of your interpreters locally to continue, Sonia to try to make sure that she's having an impact for the children in this area, or to make sure they can do those exact same things.
Actually, yes, Sonia had been providing some interpreting services to one of the local high schools for quite a while. And many of the public schools hire their own interpreters. We actually would not have enough staff or enough time to meet all of the needs of the public school children who are in the mainstream settings. But what we do like to do is provide some trainings. We will bring people up to the school in the summer and provide some training to educational interpreters and help them to hone their skills, because they're often working in an isolated situation. So we like to bring them in and talk about some of the strategies that work very well for students. It's a tough thing for students to watch an interpreter all day long.
Oh, I bet.
Very tough.
I bet. I wonder if there are many people using your services in our area. Do you have any idea if there's a substantial number of folks, let's say within the Coastal Regional Outreach Service Center area? I'm
not exactly sure. I know the number statewide. We provide almost 7,500 hours a year.
Is that right? Wow.
And a lot of that would be in this area as well. Columbia and Spartanburg are a little bit higher in usage because of the number of deaf people there.
Right.
But altogether in the state, it's a little over 7,000.
I think I saw y'all are also running a interpreting class here in the Conway office. You know how that's going?
A community sign language class. Yes, it's great. Dr. Bamback, who is the regional outreach coordinator or director here.
Right.
She has been teaching the class for us. There was some significant interest in the area to have the classes, and we actually have just hired an American Sign Language coordinator who is a deaf woman, Kathy Holst, who will be working on campus, but coordinating the sign language classes so that we can provide community sign language classes all over the state for people who are interested.
And for people who are interested, and people who are interested in possibly learning to become an interpreter, the training now, you said, I think will be it would be a little shorter than it will be in the not too distant future. Is that for the really advanced qualifications? Is there still some basic training that could go on if folks had an interest in becoming an interpreter?
My recommendation for people who want to become an interpreter is get to a university where they can get sign language taught on a semester basis.
Right.
What we teach are 8 weeks of some conversational sign language that would be. That's great, but it would not prepare someone to be an interpreter. And also, becoming an interpreter is a really long process to become fluent in the language. It's just, I would say, an average of about 4 years of training and then another probably 5 years of practice to be ready to sit for the exam.
If you hadn't grown up in College Park and hadn't seen the deaf folks around and hadn't had that, I mean, what do you think you'd be doing? I mean, it's so fascinating to think about. I'm just wondering if you weren't in this position with the South Carolina School for the Deaf and Blind? What do you think you'd be doing?
Well, to be honest with you, the way I got into sign language was in my junior year, picking my courses for the next year. And I was going to take a pottery class. And then I saw sign language, and I thought, I really don't want to get my nails dirty every day. So I'm going to take sign language. And that changed everything for me.
Oh, yeah. That's a great story.
What? I know. And you just think one little decision like that, basically almost like the flip of a coin. And I found what is my absolute passion in life is to work with this language and learn more about it.
That's wonderful. You're still learning.
Absolutely. I learn every day.
That's great.
Something new every day. And have enjoyed every minute of it. I don't like to tell my boss, but I have the best job on campus.
Listen to that.
I really
That's
do.
wonderful. Thanks so much for being with us this morning, Kathy.
Yeah. Well, you're welcome. It was delightful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Stay tuned to more Carolina People with Kathy Stoehr coming up next. We're at the Coastal Regional Outreach Center all week long for the South Carolina School for the Deaf and Blind, right here in Conway. But this impacts so many. It serves Horry County and 11 area counties. There's regional outreach centers all over the state. The main campus located in Spartanburg. If you've been here with Kathy the last 25 minutes, you learn a little bit about sign language. You learn that it's not universal. It's not a form of English. There's a lot to it. There's complex, abstract ideas that can be culled from American Sign Language. Take the time to learn about it. Give them a call at 843-248-8100, or you can go online at www.scsdb.k12.sc.us. It's a great opportunity. Think about that opportunity for her, sitting around the dinner table and the experience of being with a family, and then somehow, by accident, learning a new language. That aspect that she talked about, not wanting to get her fingernails dirty. We love that, which brought her in an entire new language, and the experience to be able to share that with so many now, not only around the state but around the nation. Stay tuned. We got a big week ahead.